160. Serious. That is the number of kilograms of plutonium-239 a fully operational IR-40 reactor at Arak was capable of producing per year. 160 kilograms. Now ask yourself, how much weapons-grade plutonium does it take to build a nuclear device? Roughly 8. Do the math, and what you get is not an energy program. What you get is a production line. Size. I have spent years studying the architecture of nuclear programs that were never supposed to exist. And what I found at Arak was not unusual. The unusual part was how long the map we were given refused to show what was actually there.
The IR-40 reactor at Arak is not a name that appears in most news cycles. It tends to surface in brief dispatches, usually attached to the word strike or the phrase IAEA inspection. But if you trace the technical record, the design specifications, the IAEA safeguards reports, the classified intelligence assessments that have since been partially declassified, a very precise picture emerges, and precision in this field is everything. Here is what this video is going to do. It is going to show you that the Arak reactor was not a scientific anomaly or a diplomatic incident. It was a recurring chapter in a story that began in the 1940s, a story about what heavy water reactors actually do, who has built them before, and what history has consistently shown happens when the map they give you and the map that actually exists stop matching. Let's start with the mechanism, because the mechanism is everything. A heavy water reactor, unlike a standard light water reactor, does not need enriched uranium to operate. It runs on natural uranium, uranium that has not been processed through the enormously expensive enrichment cascade that most other reactor types require. Curious. That sounds like an efficiency argument. It is not. The design consequence of running on natural uranium in a heavy water moderator is that the reactor produces plutonium-239 as a byproduct of normal operation. This is not a flaw in the design. This is the design. Serious plutonium-239 is the material used in the implosion-type devices that destroyed Nagasaki in 1945 and in every subsequent generation of compact nuclear warhead architecture. The IR-40 at Arak was, by the IAEA's own documented assessments, capable of producing roughly 8 to 10 kilograms of plutonium per year once fully operational, enough for a T&E device annually. Some technical estimates put the potential output considerably higher. This is the historical pattern that almost no mainstream coverage of Arak ever engages with seriously. Thoughtful. Heavy water reactors have been the preferred early-stage infrastructure for every state that has successfully developed a nuclear weapon outside the NPT framework. Canada's NRX reactor at Chalk River, which came online in 1947, was the direct technical ancestor of the Cyrus reactor India acquired in 1954, described at the time as a research instrument for peaceful development. Cyrus produced the plutonium used in India's 1974 Smiling Buddha test. The same design logic, the same map that lies, the same outcome. Pause. North Korea's 5-megawatt reactor at Yongbyon, still operational in modified form today, follows the same architecture. The reactor that produced the plutonium for Pakistan's weapons program was acquired officially as a research facility. France's G1 reactor at Marcoule, which fed the original French weapons program, was a heavy water moderated design before it was converted. Exhales. The pattern is not circumstantial, it is structural. The IR-40 at Arak was a 40-megawatt thermal reactor. By comparison, a standard commercial reactor is typically 1,000 megawatts electric, roughly 3,000 megawatts thermal. Curious, Arak was not built to power a city. At 40 megawatts thermal, it sits precisely in the range that weapons program designers have historically targeted, large enough to produce meaningful quantities of plutonium small enough to be plausibly described as a research reactor serving a civilian nuclear science program. Pause. The site itself sits approximately 250 kilometers southwest of Tehran, in a region where geography provided meaningful protection from satellite observation in early construction phases. IAEA inspectors first gained access to declared nuclear sites under the Additional Protocol framework after 2003, following the exposure of Iran's previously clandestine enrichment program at Natanz and the heavy water production facility at Arak itself, both of which were revealed not by IAEA detection, but by an Iranian opposition group in August of that year. The IAEA's reports on Arak from 2004 through 2013 contain language that, if you read the technical sections carefully, is as close to an institutional alarm as safeguards bureaucracy ever produces. Concerned, the agency noted repeatedly that Iran had not provided design information for the IR-40 in a timely manner as required under its subsidiary arrangements. It documented that construction had advanced significantly before inspectors had access to assess the design's compliance with safeguards obligations. What the IAEA found when it did get access was a reactor that, in its original design configuration, would have produced spent fuel with the isotopic composition optimal for weapons-grade plutonium extraction. Serious. This is a technical detail that carries significant weight. The ratio of Pu-239 to Pu-240 in spent fuel depends on how long the fuel rods remain in the core. Reactors optimized for electricity production run fuel rods for extended periods, which degrades the weapon's usability of the plutonium produced. The IR-40's original operational parameters were consistent with shorter irradiation cycles. The IAEA's reports flagged this design characteristic explicitly. In January 2024, Iran's Arak reactor, which had been rendered inoperable under the terms of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, with its core filled with concrete as part of the agreed modification process, was struck. Serious. The strike targeted the heavy water production facility adjacent to the reactor complex. Attributed by multiple intelligence assessments to Israel, the operation was part of a broader escalatory sequence following the collapse of JCPOA renegotiation efforts and the documented acceleration of Iranian enrichment to 60% and then 84%, levels that have no civilian application in any currently operational Iranian nuclear program. Pause. The strike was precise. It was not designed to produce casualties. Its operational objective, consistent with the doctrinal pattern of Israeli counter-proliferation actions since the Osirak strike in Iraq in 1981, was to impose a delay, to destroy infrastructure that would require months or years to rebuild without triggering a response threshold that would compel a conventional military reply. Here is where the economic layer becomes essential. Thoughtful. The heavy water production facility at Arak represented roughly a decade of cumulative investment, engineering, construction, and operational calibration. Heavy water itself, deuterium oxide, costs approximately $700 to $1,000 per kilogram at commercial production scale. A reactor of the IR-40's size requires on the order of 90 metric tons of heavy water as moderator and coolant. The replacement cost of that inventory alone runs into the tens of millions of dollars, exclusive of facility reconstruction. Pause. More significantly, the specialized workforce, the reactor physicists, the heavy water production engineers, the fuel fabrication technicians, represents a human capital investment that cannot be restocked through procurement. It is trained slowly in a sanctions environment that has systematically constrained Iran's access to international scientific collaboration since 2006. Serious, the strike was not destroying a building. It was attacking a knowledge production infrastructure that took decades to build. What are the actual options available to the actors in this situation? For Iran, the choices are narrow, and each carries a defined cost: rebuild and face repeated strikes. The Osirak precedent suggests that rebuilt facilities become permanent targets. Accept the JCPOA modification terms permanently, which means surrendering the plutonium pathway while retaining the enrichment pathway, an asymmetric concession that Iranian nuclear strategists have consistently resisted. Thoughtful, or advance the program through alternative architectures, smaller, hardened, dispersed facilities that are harder to strike but also harder to operate at scale. Each path has a price tag and a detection risk profile. None of them disappears simply because the building does. Size. For the international community, the calculus is different but equally constrained. The IAEA's legal authority under standard comprehensive safeguards agreements is narrow. It can verify declared facilities and declared materials. It cannot compel access to undeclared sites without the additional protocol which Iran suspended in 2021. The agency's February 2023 report confirmed that Iran had significantly reduced cooperation with IAEA monitoring, including the disabling of surveillance cameras at multiple sites. Concerned? What the agency can see and what actually exists are not the same map. There are four trajectories that analysts at institutions like the RAND Corporation, the Institute for Science and International Security, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace have outlined as the plausible futures for Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Thoughtful. The first, a negotiated return to enhanced safeguards and a modified JCPOA framework in which the plutonium pathway stays closed, enrichment is capped below 5%, and the breakout timeline remains measurable in months rather than weeks. This scenario requires political will that has not been visible in either Tehran or Washington for the past 3 years. Size. The second, continued attrition through strikes and sanctions, with Iran maintaining a latent capability, enough technical knowledge and enriched material to move to weaponization in a defined time frame, but without taking the final step that would trigger a larger military response. This is the scenario that has characterized the past 2 years. Serious. The third, an Iranian decision to cross the declared threshold, either testing a device or publicly announcing weapons capability, in the model of North Korea in 2006. The deterrence logic is visible and well documented. The escalation risk is also significant in ways that the Korean Peninsula context did not include. The fourth, a regional diplomatic architecture that addresses the underlying security calculus driving Iranian nuclear investment, specifically the absence of any formal security guarantee and the presence of nuclear-armed neighbors in both Israel and Pakistan. This scenario has the most robust theoretical support in international relations literature and the least political traction in current conditions. Thoughtful. I want to spend a moment on what this actually means for the person watching this, because the tendency in coverage of Iranian nuclear developments is to treat this as a story about governments and weapon systems. It is that, but underneath the technical specifications and the diplomatic negotiations, there is a simpler and more durable question. Pause. The Arak reactor, like the Yongbyon reactor, like the Cyrus reactor before it, is a story about what happens when the information available to the public, the maps that governments, media, and international institutions provide, systematically misrepresents the territory. The NPT framework was built on the assumption that civilian and military nuclear applications could be kept in separate boxes. The history of heavy water reactors is, in part, the history of how consistently that assumption has failed. If you're 45 or 55 or 65, you have watched this pattern play out at least twice in your lifetime. In Iraq in 1991, in North Korea through the 1990s and 2000s, in Libya before the 2003 dismantlement, in Syria with the Al-Kibar facility destroyed in 2007. Be thoughtful. The map that says research reactor and the map that shows a weapons production pathway have historically been the same map, just read by different people with access to different data. So let's close with what the record shows. The IR-40 at Arak was a heavy water reactor designed to a specification that has, historically, preceded weapons development in every country that has followed this path. Serious? The IAEA documented design characteristics inconsistent with a purely civilian program. The 2015 JCPOA required its modification, and that modification was completed under international verification. The January 2024 strike on the heavy water production facility represents the latest chapter in a counter-proliferation doctrine that has been applied consistently since 1981. Measured. What the IAEA said after the strike was, in its characteristic measured language, that it was monitoring the situation, that it had requested access, that it was engaging with Iranian authorities. The agency said what it can say within the limits of its mandate. What the data says, the design specifications, the isotopic production parameters, the historical pattern across 7 decades of heavy water reactor programs, says something that takes longer to read, but that does not change depending on who is in office in Tehran or Washington. Thoughtful. The question I want to leave you with is this: when the map and the territory stop matching, who decides which one is real? And what happens to the people who rely on the wrong one? Curious. If you want to understand the enrichment side of this story, what 84% enrichment actually means operationally, and how the Fordo facility fits into the technical picture, that is the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it.